Hey everyone, it's Coach Tyler. I am going to be doing a February topic lecture for you all today about the February topic. It shouldn't be too long, but you should probably watch this during practice if you're assigned to do so. And I will also maybe assign this to some of you to watch if you're competing in February at the novice level, but I'm not at practice, something like that. But this is going to be a topic lecture that all of Quarry Lane can watch whenever you want. So, first off, let's talk about what the resolution says. The resolution is resolved on ballots the benefits of urbanization in West Africa outweigh the harms. So when we're talking about this resolution, obviously it's interesting for the NSDA to pick a very specific and not really global resolution like we've seen in the past. We've seen the NSA topic, which is about U.S. domestically, but it has a lot of international spillover ARGs, the BRI topic in recent years, which is very international, and the scope of this topic is much more narrow. It's talking about the benefits and the harms of a specific region in a specific nation. And a little bit, we'll get into the region and where that region is and why that region matters a little bit later. But let's talk about just a little bit, what do we see when we're looking at the resolution? So keywords, the phrase on balance is to mean all things considered. So essentially, imagine Lady Justice. Lady Justice is holding up two sides. They're equal sides, right? On balance is looking at these things with everything considered on both sides and making the determination what is more right, what is more wrong, and why is it more right and why is it more wrong, and which side should we prefer with everything considered. So there's nothing left out of this argument. It's not like the NSA topic where it's only domestic surveillance and not all NSA surveillance. It's not NSA surveillance on balance because it was just NSA domestic. But now this entire resolution is on balance. Everything that has to do with the urbanization of West Africa is up for grabs. The term urbanization refers to population shift from rural areas to urban areas. So obviously, for my novices, a rural area is a place with little population growth or little population density. Maybe they don't have access to a lot of big resources like cities do. Essentially, living in a rural America is maybe living somewhere in rural Kansas without access to running water, without access to electricity, things like that. That would probably be a more rural area. A more urban area would be a more industrialized area. It would be more job opportunity. It would also be a lot more people. It would be a lot more dense. It would also have things like running water, electricity, and a lot of other benefits that pretty much, to a certain extent, only exist within cities in West Africa because it is a very poor region. With that being said, there are lots of West African countries currently, and they have a very widespread population centers and not incredibly large cities like we have in the United States. So, for example, in the United States, we have 20 million people that live in New York City. In West Africa, they have roughly the same population as the United States, but their biggest city is maybe 1 to 2 million people. They haven't urbanized to the extent of like what Western countries have done in terms of city growth, but there are arguments to be made is that urbanization is good and that urbanization is bad at the same time. So, the resolution at the end says outweigh the harms. So, do the benefits outweigh the harms? The affirmative would be saying yes, the benefits of urbanization are good for Africa, or they are good in general, and they outweigh the harms that come from urbanizing. The negative would be saying the exact opposite. The negative would be saying that the harms are so bad that they outweigh any benefits of urbanization. And we'll get into what arguments look like later, but that's how the sides are going to be looking, and both sides are going to be defending that. This resolution is essentially a cost-benefit analysis. A cost-benefit analysis is a very common term used in PF. It's basically saying, let's look at the cost, let's look at the benefit, and let's make a decision as to what is better. The cost in this case would be the harms, and the benefits would obviously be the benefits. So we're looking at what matters more. This is a very simple util resolution. Who helps more people? What matters more? What's better and what's worse? And what's the cost and what can we get for that cost? Very, very straightforward. Weighing is going to be very, very easy on this topic. It's just asking benefits versus harms. That's all you need to know. So now, let's get into what is West Africa. And this is a complicated question, but it's not really that complicated. So obviously we can see on our map above us that it looks like Algeria, Western Sahara, Morocco, and the Canary Islands, which are technically a part of Spain because of colonial order, would be a part of what looks to be Western Africa, but it's actually not. According to the United Nations, the 16 countries you see here outlined in that lighter yellow color are considered to be the region of West Africa, and this is where the debate is going to be focused upon, ladies and gentlemen. It's going to be these 16 countries right here. And within these 16 countries, we see some very important countries. We see that number one, West Africa is on the coast. And when we think about the coast, we think about trading with North America. We maybe think about the slave trade, right? Because a lot of slaves are coming from West Africa and going straight to Brazil, and then what we call the triangle between the Caribbean islands, Brazil, and West Africa. The West African economy has been in shambles for a long time because obviously they were exploited by Western civilizations for slave labor, and also just because they've kind of been looked down and been ruled by other colonial powers in Europe, such as France, such as Spain, such as the Dutch, people like that. And if you've ever taken AP World History, you would know about that. And that leads us to the fact that the GDP per capita in Africa is $1,920, which is one of the poorest regions on Earth. For comparison, the average GDP of American today is around $63,000 in America, adjusted for inflation, and that would be in nominal dollars. And the real dollars, which is not adjusted for inflation, would be roughly $46,000, depending on which economic factor you use. Regardless, it's still much, much more than Africa, or especially West Africa, and this is one of the least developed in terms of economically regions on the planet. There are 381 million people that live in this region, so it is fairly large, and it also takes up a large portion of, geographically. This entire continent of Africa, or this entire part of Africa that we're looking at, is nearly the size of the entire United States. Africa is the biggest continent on the planet. I think, I don't know. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Or it's the biggest to scale. But Africa is very, very large, and you can pretty much fit like 5 United States in the entirety of Africa. Maybe Africa is not the biggest continent. I think it's Asia. But it's bigger than what you see on the maps. That makes it pretty interesting. So a couple countries we see that are kind of interesting. Number one, if we look towards the left part of our screen, we see tons of red dots. We see Dakar, we see Bissau, we see Freetown, we see a lot of well-known cities that are well-known for ports, right? So we see there's a lot more red dots concentrated upon the outside and the outskirts of the country towards the Gulf of Guinea, or Guyana, excuse me, because that is where trade is coming in. That's where things are going to be exported and imported. So that's why there's so many cities there. So there could be a direct debate about what cities matter, what cities don't. But this also, West Africa accounts for the country of Nigeria, which is a very rich and oil-rich country, and this country's definitely going to come up a lot. The Niger River is going to be very, very important. About pollution in the river on this topic. What does urbanization do to the river? What does it do to the livestock? We'll get into that a little bit later. More importantly, how do we know, Tyler, that this is West Africa? Well, the Economic Community of West African States, the ECOWAS, it'll come up a lot on this topic, was founded in 1975, and it was a collective of 16 countries that came together and that said, hey, we are going to unionize, we are going to help, and we are going to grow the region, and our goal is economic growth for Western Africa. That is our ultimate goal. And the United Nations has since taken this resolution, and they have agreed and dictated that this is truly the region of West Africa. There is a little bit of debate about whether I think it's the island of Cape Verde is included within this, and it is in this map, but in some it's not, because it's technically considered an off-coast island, and it kind of depends. It depends who you ask, but it's really, really small. It probably won't matter much in this resolution. Just be focusing on this land right here. Cool. So, some arguments and ideas, ladies and gentlemen. Whoa, switch to the wrong slide. Let me fix this. So, lots of articles online talk about the wildlife in Western Africa. Poaching is a real problem. In Western Africa, there's lots of elephants, and elephants obviously are poached for their ivory. The elephant population has dwindled, and there's almost 500 elephants left in the region. So they're having a serious, serious problem with poaching. And a lot of that could be due to urbanization, right? The more urbanization you have, the more wealthy people come to live in the city. Those wealthy people want ivory, so that increases poaching. Or maybe urbanization leads to more ivy poaching industries, and ivy poaching industries are bad because it increases the supply and the ability for poachers to kill elephants, because now they have more resources, because now they live in a city. So it's pretty much a scalar effect. Urbanization is affecting every facet of wildlife. Specifically, it leads to more consumption, because when people urbanize, they need more resources and stuff. So maybe it leads to more hunting, maybe it leads to more mass factory farming, maybe it leads to more greenhouse gases being emitted through cattle farming, sheep farming, all that good stuff. That's kind of the problem. There's also a problem with wildfires in West Africa. It's a very, very dry region, and if there there ever is a wildfire, it could take out large portions of livestock, and also it could increase greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and you already know what that does. Typical greenhouse gas bad. CO2 emissions going up is really, really bad for the environment, everything like that, right? So it kind of just depends. But that is a pretty solid argument we could be making there. Wildfires are obviously bad. How does urbanization lead to wildfires? Well, that's a good question. The more we urbanize, maybe the more we do, the less regulation there is, because people are doing their own thing. People just want to maximize their profit, and maybe those wildfires are bad, and maybe they pop up more often because we're doing less regulations and bushfires and stuff like that. It's kind of non-unique, but I think urbanization, we could probably find a card that there's urbanizations lead to wildfire. Cool. The other thing I want to talk about is the extinction of species due to overconsumption and lack of regulation. Once again, the elephants that I brought up earlier, there's also some tigers and some caribou and stuff on the plain that's being really, really overconsumed and really, really overhunted, because in West Africa there aren't a lot of environmental regulations. You don't need a hunter's license to kill a deer. You can just go out and kill a deer. Whereas in the United States, you would need a hunter's license. It's very, very regulated. There's people working towards this issue, making sure that we conserve parts of our environment and making sure that animals stay safe and aren't going into extinction. But in Africa, those agencies don't really exist, because once again, Africa is still, Western Africa specifically is still definitely developing by all means. They don't really have the Environmental Protection Agency like we would have in the United States. With that being said, another big argument on this topic is definitely going to be deforestation. I mentioned Nigeria is going to be a very, very important topic area on this topic. Nigeria is heavily impacted by deforestation. It is estimated in West Africa alone that 90% of their forest has been destroyed directly due to deforestation and poor environmental oversight from countries. Also, urbanization definitely leads to this, because it leads to more lumber being used, more trees being cut down, more land being cleared so people can live. So urbanization and deforestation are very, very clearly linked. I don't think there's a really good argument going for deforestation good, and I think the biggest argument that's going to be made on this topic as to why urbanization is bad, so this would be a negative argument as to how the harms outweigh the benefits, is going to be this deforestation argument about how we've already seen so much deforestation. If we see any more, it could push West Africa to the brink of almost no trees, almost no plants, almost no forests, and with no forest there's no wood, there's no shelter for animals, and it just creates a really, really bad environment that hurts the entire wildlife cycle, that could devastate everyone. So deforestation also definitely leads to more climate change, because the more we cut down trees, the more CO2 gets into the atmosphere. Trees are really important for bringing oxygen into the atmosphere, as I'm sure you all know. And also population growth, people coming together, it leads to more deforestation, because trees give resources. They need those resources, whether it be a berry or an apple tree. You need apples or stuff like that, right? There isn't really there is farming, but it's not to the extent of the farming in the United States. It's kind of a different and more subsistence level, as opposed to mass factory farms and mass tractors and mass plows like we're seeing in the United States of America. With that being said, another important argument on this topic is going to be overfishing. So it's actually estimated that 2 billion people on this planet, and this is just an outside fact that I'm sure you all have heard from other resolutions, 2 billion people on this planet, their primary source of food is fish, and West Africa is no different. A lot of these individuals rely on fish as their primary source of food, and there's actually lots of foreign traveler companies and foreign fisheries that operate in Africa. It's kind of a form of foreign direct investment. It's these foreign companies coming in, they overfish the waters of West Africa on the coast, and that really, really hurts the locals, because they don't really get access to that fish, and it's just shipped abroad and given to other wealthier Western countries. And fishing stock is obviously very, very important for these people to live in, because if fish is your primary source of food and now all the fish is gone, what are you supposed to eat? And another thing here is there's also some conversations about oil. West Africa is a fairly oil-rich region, and Nigeria definitely profits a lot from oil. And there's also lots of foreign countries that come in for oil, and maybe urbanization plays a role in oil production. Maybe it inhibits oil production. Maybe it increases oil production. Maybe oil production is bad for the environment, but maybe oil production is good for the economic development of Africa and lifting people out of poverty. So there definitely is going to be a debate there about, is the urbanization and oil production through urbanization good for the people of Africa? Is it bad for the people of the world? Is it bad for climate change? There's going to be a really, really good debate there. That's kind of one reason why I like this topic. So Let's talk about the causes of urbanization. So recently, West Africa has seen a rapid rise of urbanization. According to one estimate, urbanization has gone up nearly 85% in the past 10 years in West Africa because we're seeing a lot more initiatives to prioritize transportation. So, for example, the ECOWAS corporation, or I should say conglomerate of African countries that we talked about earlier, they're making transportation their number one priority. If you look at the map, we can clearly see that there is pretty much the Trans-West African Coastal Highway. It's through trains, has almost entirely engulfs the entirety of West Africa. It's paved and unpaved. So we see that it looks like the majority of it is paved, and there are certainly road networks that are all across the coast of West Africa. Think of, well, you don't have this on the West Coast because you don't have I-95, but think of the I think it's called like the Bay Area Highway or something. It just goes all the way across the beach on the Pacific Ocean. It's very similar to that, but it's just not as there's not as much money spent on infrastructure in West Africa because it's a poorer region and it's not to the same extent. But they definitely do have transportation, and that transportation has led people from inward places in the country, maybe like the two middle cities that we see in the orange, to move outward to the coast and to urbanize in urban areas. And we also even see that some transportation networks have actually met one another. So in Lagos, we see that there's a blue line, there's the yellow line, and the green line. They all meet in one place. And excuse me if I'm mispronouncing this, Kano is no different. We see that there is an orange line and a yellow line connecting where transportation networks meet. That's typically a hub where for people to be. So there's definitely a strong argument to make here that it is accurate that in a world with transportation where people link up together just because of it's easier to live. Transportation also leads to easier movement in cities, and it certainly increases urbanization. Should be pretty obvious as to why. So, urbanization. This is kind of a take. Could it lead to sectarian violence? So, let's think about Palestine and Israel, right? Obviously, as both countries have become more urbanized, there's been an ongoing dispute between religious differences between the Palestinians and the Israelis, the Muslims versus the Jews. And the same could be said in, I guess, India as well. Pakistan and India, there's definitely some conflict there between Hindi and Muslim individuals, and that creates sectarian violence, and that sectarian violence could be bad. So maybe an argument on this topic could be, considering roughly 60% of West Africa identifies with the Muslim religion, that there could be some sectarian violence in urbanized centers between the other two religions, which are encompassed in the African traditional religions. That's a large group of African religions that are sorted together by scholars because there's so many and it's kind of complex, and we don't really know the inner workings of this religion, and also just Christianity. So maybe urbanization of populations leads to more sectarian violence because when they're all in the same area, it creates problems. There's beef, stuff like that. And when urbanization comes, it puts people in groups with different belief systems in close proximity and could fuel violence. This has been seen all across the world. It's just like in China as well. We've seen the Chinese government has captured many Uyghur Muslims in internment camps because China obviously subscribes to a fairly Christian notion, if I'm correct, and they really see Muslims as the outsiders, and that's fueled a form of sectarian violence, and that's kind of because of urbanization that the Han Chinese people could even get to that portion of the country. That's through the roads and transportation, which have fueled urbanization. So maybe there's an argument there. And the last thing I kind of want to talk about on this topic is the women's peace movement. I think there could be an interesting argument about feminism here and about how maybe urbanization helps or hurts feminism. Basically, UN Resolution 1325 helped women gain the courage to protest and fight against war-torn instability in Africa. Basically, it was just like the UN was like, we have your back, we're going to fight with you, we'll give you resources, all that good stuff. So obviously, women in West Africa have taken a stand, and there has been a increasing call to feminism recently, and it certainly has brought down the war-torn notion of West Africa. And if we even see in the bottom right hand of our corner the image, we see West African women kind of wearing their hair in a very particular modern feminist kind of way. The short hair kind of signifies the defiance from what I read in the article, and it's also important because it goes against traditional tribal standards about what a woman's hair should look like, how a woman should dress, and it's kind of important because it shows that maybe urbanization and modernization through urbanization and feminism has led to the empowerment of women in the region, which could be really, really good for a multitude of reasons. The Women's Peace and Security Network is the entire organization overseeing this this rise in women's movement in Africa. It's actually based in the capital city of Ghana. I'm blanking on the name. And the primary organization is responsible for advocating for women's rights in West Africa. And the question I pose to you all is, could urbanization positively impact this movement by increasing knowledge about it? The answer is probably yes, right? Because if we have more urbanization, more people understand about this movement, because obviously the movement spreads much easier in urban areas because they're more dense and more closely populated, and there's more and quicker, easier means of communication than it does in a rural area with less means of communication. So maybe this will cause rise to feminism movement in Western Africa that could be really, really good, and it could be good for hundreds of reasons. Propping up women, good. Women having the right to vote. I don't know, democracy, stuff like that. Just some things I wanted to share with you. So obviously, if we look at the chart on the right, the levels of urbanization, and urbanization is in some languages spelled with the S, in some languages it's spelled with the Z. I don't know the difference, but I think it's interesting. So here we have the levels of urbanization over time in West Africa. So obviously, since the founding of the ECOWAS, which is in 1975, we've seen a rapid increase in urbanization in almost every country in Africa. The lowest country we see is roughly 24% increase in urbanization, whereas the highest countries are upwards of 70 to 80% of urbanization in the past couple of years. So we've clearly seen that there has been an increase in urbanization recently, and that trend is probably a good or bad thing depending on which side of the resolution you fall on. Pros and cons of urbanization. Number one, urbanization lowers child mortality rates. This should be fairly obvious. Obviously, birthing practices in rural places aren't going to be as advanced as them in urban places, because there's more medical technology, there's more doctors, there's more stuff like that. So child mortality rates are a huge problem in Africa in general, just because of malnourishment and things like that, and also just because of the lack of doctoral training. And the child death rate is very, very high in Africa as opposed to a country in the United States. So urbanization is definitely good to reduce those children's deaths, and that's probably a reason as to why urbanization might be good in general. But there's also some flip sides to urbanization. Urbanization certainly causes more pollution, whether it be foreign companies coming in and polluting the waters, or just localized urbanization itself. It leads to more pollution, which could be really bad for waterways, could be bad for the air, could be bad for the environment, all sorts of stuff. It also leads to inefficient water consumption, because if we're urbanizing, people aren't really consuming water. They're more wasteful with their water, right? So like a good example is like showering in America. You might shower for 10 minutes, but in reality, you only need a 1-minute shower to get your shower done. In rural places in Africa, they're so low on resources that truthfully that 1-minute shower is enough. But once you have the luxury of having more resources, it leads to the overusage of resources, which could be really, really bad and leads to inefficient water consumption. The second thing is about poor air quality, right? So obviously, the more greenhouse gas we emit and the more CO2 we emit into the atmosphere, we're going to see that air quality is going to get worse. China is a great example of this. If you've heard of smog, you can look up. It's spelled as it sounds. It's actually this black fog that hangs above China because they've industrialized and urbanized to such a point where there are these microplastics in the atmosphere, and it's like a black dust. And that's why, if you even so post-corona, people in China in some cities like Pyongyang, not Pyongyang, Shanghai, are actually wearing masks because the pollution is so bad in some of the really industrialized regions of China. That's an interesting point. And another thing I want to be asking you is, how do foreign powers have a stake in African urbanization? Do foreign powers have any influence in African urbanization? And if so, would the urbanization of Africa be good for specific countries? And why would it be good for specific countries, right? So, for example, the Chinese BRI project, as I'm sure you all know, because maybe you've debated this topic, the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative is essentially a Chinese infrastructure project where they're giving loans to African countries to build infrastructure, right? How does China have a stake in West African urbanization? Do they have a stake? Is that a good or bad thing? Walk me through how that's good or bad, right? There's also in the United States, there's foreign direct investment. We talked about FDI a lot on this topic, right? Is FDI good? Is FDI bad? How does FDI contribute to urbanization? Is that contribution good? And does the FDI that the United States brings in crowd out localized industry? Is that good or bad? The third one is the Russian geopolitical inferences. We've kind of seen this a lot in proxy wars in Iran and Saudi Arabia, but what role does Russia have in this? Is Russia at all involved? Let's think of the other global major superpowers, maybe Japan and Germany. How are they involved in West Africa? Does urbanization benefit them? Or does their assistance in urbanization benefit Africa, West Africa? I don't know, but these are interesting topic areas. And the other question I have is, does urbanization bring in other international countries and spur FDI? So maybe an argument is that urbanization is good because it leads to more investment from foreign companies, and foreign companies are key to lifting Africa out of poverty. Or maybe it's that foreign companies are bad because it leads to an increase of a phenomenon called Dutch disease, which I'm sure you'll be researching a lot on this topic. That is essentially the notion that when we have foreign foreign industries coming in, it's really, really bad because it crowds out domestic industry. That's all I have for this topic lecture. Thanks so much for sticking with me. Any questions, message me on Slack.